Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this very exciting MBBI Peace Connect session entitled Earthly Order, How Natural Laws Define Human Life. MBBI, Mediators Beyond Borders International, keeps people affected by conflict at the center of peace building, and we are very excited to host this conversation today. Thank you so much to our fabulous board member, Dr. Saleem Ali, for being here and writing this fabulous book and sharing his wisdom with us. I will read his bio and then we will begin. Dr. Saleem H. Ali was born in New Bedford, Massachusetts, but grew up in Lahore, Pakistan until his college years, receiving his bachelor's in chemistry from Tufts University and his master's and PhD degrees in environmental policy and planning at Yale and MIT, respectively. He currently holds the Blue and Gold Distinguished Professorship in Geography and Spatial Sciences at the University of Delaware and is an honorary professor at the University of Queensland. Dr. Ali's laurels include being a National Geographic explorer, having traveled for research to over 150 countries, being chosen as a young global leader by the World Economic Forum, and serving on the 7-member science panel of the Global Environment Facility, the world's largest multilateral trust fund for the environment held in trusteeship by the World Bank. His earlier books include Treasures of the Earth, Need, Greed, and a Sustainable Future, which was hailed by Nobel laureate Muhammad Yunus as providing a welcome linkage between environmental behavior and poverty alleviation. Professor Ali was profiled in Forbes as the alchemist and bookseller, called his earlier work a pioneering exploration of human wants and needs and the natural resources we consume. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts and the Royal Geographic Society in the United Kingdom and serves on the boards of Adventure Scientists and Mediators Beyond Borders International. Along with his wife Maria and sons Shahmir and Shahroz, the family are citizens of Australia, Pakistan, and the United States. We are so excited to have him here today. Thank you so much, Dr. Saleem Ali, for your contributions today. As a reminder to everyone, this is being recorded. You will receive the recording, and especially since this is a book talk, the link to the book as well. We will have an interactive Q&A, and feel free to engage with Dr. Ali on all aspects of today's conversation. Thanks so much, and I will hand the floor to Dr. Ali.
Thank you so much, Ben. It's great to connect with the MBBI audience, and I hope that we will also be able to have a discussion about the connections of this book with the mission of Mediators Beyond Borders. This book is my most ambitious work so far, and it touches on areas of research that I've been working on for the past 20 years or so. So what I'll do is basically give you a teaser for some of the key themes of the book, and then we can have a discussion. I'll probably go on for about 35 to 40 minutes. So this is the cover of the book. It is just being released this week, more or less. The Kindle edition or the electronic tablet edition was released on Friday. So those of you who like to read on tablets can download it right away on Amazon. And I would really appreciate that you spread the word about this book because it is written for a general audience. It is a labor of love. I'm actually donating all the royalties for environmental literacy programs. I wrote this book primarily because over the last 20 years that I've taught Earth system science and policy, sustainability science, environmental studies, and have been trying to navigate this space between natural science aspects of environmental systems and the social consequences of not understanding those systems. I felt a need for a book like this. Either you have books about the environment which are very focused on the science, or you have those which are very focused on the policy. And what this book tries to do is connect the two genres. And I've done it using the scaffolding of order as a means of making the argument that one of the reasons why we have so much conflict over environmental issues when they should be actually a means of bringing us together is because we have not been able to make that science policy interface effectively, and that people do not have foundational knowledge many times about the reasons why we need to have certain decisions that are based on limits, planetary limits of the planet, of our natural systems, of the laws of nature, and so on. So the book is divided into three parts. The first part is natural order, the second part is social and economic order, and the third part is political order. And that's the kind of ambition of the book, is that it provides that full range of understanding. So I was very honored to get some great endorsements in advance, including from Roald Hoffmann, who's a Nobel Prize winner in chemistry, but he's also a poet. And he's a very rare science laureate who is also a poet, and he was a professor of humane letters at Cornell until his retirement. And he was really very generous in this endorsement, in saying that as a popularizer of science, he felt that this book also communicated effectively for a general audience. Those of you who are on Twitter, you're welcome to follow me there as we continue to have conversations about the book there as well. And I would just, in terms of giving you context for the range of books which led to me choosing this particular title, and also the originality of the work, I wanted to sort of situate it in the larger genre of books in this space. So some of the books that inspired me to work on this are shown here. I want to show humility as an author, that there are a lot of great writers who are doing amazing work, and I wanted to make an original contribution, but also recognizing that I've learned from a lot of these people. So if you go back, more than 2 decades, there was a very famous New York Times bestseller book called Chaos by James Glick. And this one focused on the science of complex systems. And it was written by a journalist. Essentially, James Glick is a writer for a range of publications. And it was extremely successful. Another book which was inspirational is by Nobel laureate Murray Gell-Mann, who was the founder of the Santa Fe Institute in New Mexico, that is considered one of the major think tanks to understand complexity in Earth systems. And his book, The Quark and the Jaguar, is also really interesting reading in this regard. And then there's another book called Sync by Stephen Strogatz, which is focused on the phenomenon of emergence, like how do you get ordered systems out of seemingly chaotic occurrences, and like swarms of birds and so on. Stuart Kauffman, another great complex systems scientist, wrote this book several years ago, At Home in the Universe, very much natural science oriented. So the first 4 that I'm showing you here are very natural science oriented on the whole. Even when they talk about social systems, they're really predicated in natural science. The next one, The Origins of Political Order by Francis Fukuyama, this is very much written as a political science book, but it was quite inspirational for me in part 3 of Earthly Order, because Fukuyama is famous for his book, The End of History, very controversial book. He was a student of Samuel Huntington, the guy who coined the Clash of Civilizations term. So Fukuyama, and he has actually another new book out very recently also about democracy, and he gave me some sense of how we need to consider the emergence of political institutions of order, like nation states. And there's a connection to be made there too between the way in which natural systems emerge and political systems emerge. And that's where I wanted to make the connection too. Another book which is really probably the closest to Earthly Order in its ambition is the one by Tyler Vogt, who just recently retired from NYU. It's called Quarks to Culture. And he tries to go back to fundamental physics and then trace how we can scale up from there all the way to our sense of culture. And he uses this term combiogenesis, and it's a good book. I think it has a slightly different cadence in terms of how it's written, and I bring in much more personal anecdotes and narrative, and I try to also go back to sort of that kind of learning that you would need almost as a student, so that people get basic sort of foundational concepts. And but Tyler Volk, he's been very generous also in terms of his interactions with me and complimenting me on the book, and I shared the manuscript with him also. And then finally, this recent book by Jeffrey West, who was the president of the Santa Fe Institute. This book was a big bestseller, and this is called Scale, and it basically looks at this notion of power laws, of how fundamental laws of scaling to understand how you move from small systems to large systems and so on. So these are the books which were really core inspiration, but I think I provided an original contribution in terms of really making the connection so tightly between these different aspects of order in nature as well as in society. So the goals of the book, 3 goals: providing this sense of foundational knowledge, which I was alluding to around Earth systems. And what I would say is we have environmental awareness, but we don't have environmental literacy. And one of the key goals here is to provide that environmental literacy so that we can have a more reasoned conversations. And this is true of even our friends in the activist community. Many times they don't have that same sense of fundamental knowledge around key tenets of Earth systems. Second is how to harmonize our understanding across these interdependencies. And this is where the goal of Mediators Beyond Borders is really in sync with this book, because my goal is also to use the environment as a mechanism for peace building. And I have a section in the book towards the end how earthly order, the way in which we're considering these issues, can actually help towards conflict resolution more broadly as well. And I've myself worked as a mediator in environmental conflicts. And so I see the role of science in environmental conflict resolution as being really key in this regard. And I hope this book will be a means by which we can provide that learning so that people can use the environment in that sense. The final goal is to consider that we are living in a world of trade-offs. And if we do not understand the limits of natural systems in providing us with the sustenance, but with a certain level of suboptimality, that if you have trade-offs, if you have people who are going to have competing preferences, you want a democratic system where people have some level of individual choice, you will not be able to necessarily have an optimal outcome for each variable that you want. And that's part of the way in which mediators operate, right? That's how we build consensus, that you need to figure out ways to compromise. You need to figure out what those trade-offs are, which are allowable within certain parameters of Earth systems and what are not. And so that's another goal of this book, is that it should help people figure out those trade-offs more effectively. So first of all, what do I mean by order? It's a term that has many connotations. And there are 2 ways in which you can think about order. They're within sort of the classical tradition. The Greeks had a term called cosmos, which itself meant order. When we talk about the cosmos, the universe, in that sense, its roots in Greek are in natural order. That's what cosmos means in ancient Greek. But there's another tradition in ancient Greek also, which is called taxis. And taxis connotes sort of the arrangement of how human beings might create some specific order. as well. And that arrangement or artificially created order is also part of my approach. And one of the lessons of this book I put forward is that order in Earth systems should be discovered. Like we try to understand the fundamental structure of the universe and social systems, but it can also be invented. That we should not necessarily confine ourselves to this notion of order being just deterministic, that it's there, but that it can be invented. But ultimately, I'm especially interested in the functionality of order, like what kind of order makes sense in what situation. And in some cases, we should not just gravitate towards order if it is not going to be functionally useful. In fact, it could be functionally problematic. And there are times when our brains may try to make us think there is order, but it is actually just pattern recognition that is not going to be functionally useful. So for example, prejudice comes from people considering patterns and overanalyzing patterns. And that kind of order can be very destructive. That's how we get stereotypes. Stereotypes are a function of our brain telling us that there is order in a certain way when it's not necessarily always the case, right? So we have to be very careful about the connection between patterns and prejudice in that notion of order. So functionality is very important for me. And this is an example, and this example was given there are various ways in which people have used this example, but I heard it in a talk that was given by Frances Arnold, who won the Nobel Prize some years ago in chemistry, and she gave a wonderful talk about how she thinks about chemical order. And she said, her interest is in she's a chemical engineer, and engineers are always interested in using science to solve problems, not just having pure science in and of itself. So she used this example of a book in a library. There are ways in which you can order the book, right? You can have the order by alphabetical name of the author, or you could have it by subject. And one kind of order is much more useful than the other. Right, so one is functionally more useful. That's why in the Library of Congress, classification is done by subject, not by author. But if you want to do a cataloging and you want to do a search by a specific author, that could be useful in another way. But it would not be useful as much as if you want to go to a library shelf and try and browse and find everything from a particular topic, right? So that's how I think of order, is functionality, where it's going to be useful. So these are some of the key research questions broadly I was interested in. When are such categories useful, and when do they hinder creativity, right? When do you want to have order defined and when not? What should be the delineating features by which we cast borders, especially in physical and learning space? How do we define a subject? How do we define a territory? A lot of times conflicts come from those definitions of territory and borders. How do physical laws consider order at the level of elementary particles and insights from such states, and how can they be applied to human systems? So going right from the bottom all the way to the top, like, are there ways in which we can translate order from physical science to social science? And when can we not? We don't want to necessarily say that it's always going to be deterministic, but some things would be. So for example, when we have a stampede, the way in which a stampede happens is very similar to what would happen with particles also. When people start to behave in a certain way and they end up causing a stampede. And then finally, does considering these constraints help us in developing social ecological systems that meet ecological, economic, social sustainability targets? How can we use these constraints to enable a more sustainable future? Now, from the point of view of environmental sustainability, the diagram on the left is one probably you have seen. This is a classical sort of Venn diagram for sustainable development, right? People say there's three stools of the sustainability, three legs to the stool, so to speak. You've got social, economic, environmental, and then you have these other overlapping areas. And then right in the middle is what may be termed sustainable. What I have tried to do in the book is the diagram on the right, which is to show certain hierarchies of natural, economic, political, and social order. And that natural order is ultimately going to be confining how economic, social, and political order are going to operate, right? But that doesn't mean necessarily that the natural order is deterministic of every possible outcome. What rather it means is that if we do not stay within those constraints, we will have a future which is less sustainable than what would be possible with those constraints in mind, right? So that's a big difference. I'm not saying that we have predetermined outcome because of natural order. What I'm saying is that if we do not appreciate those constraints, we'll have a future which is going to be less sustainable, though humanity may well still survive. I'm not one of those who thinks there's going to be impending doom in the future if we, go out of sync, but it will be a future that's less desirable, like a science fiction movie like Blade Runner or, Waterworld or something where the future is less desirable. The other thing I try to look at is, the ways in which we consider ordered and disordered systems is also in terms of predictability and unpredictability. So ordered systems are generally more predictable. That's why we do order. That's why we order our rooms. We order our lives because it makes our lives a bit more predictable. But within that, we have both simple and complicated forms of order. And another way people talk about this is this notion of what is known and what is unknown, right? So when you have simple, predictable situations, those are the ones which we would say are known knowns, right? And you may remember these are the kinds of terms once the former US Defense Secretary started, Donald Rumsfeld used these terms, known unknowns, unknown unknowns, and people thought, what is he talking about? And actually he was making some sense in terms of what the distinction is between, for example, complicated and complex systems. You can have a complicated system like a car engine, which has lots of different parts, but they're very predictable. If one part doesn't work, you can go and fix it, and then that's fine. So, that's where you wouldn't, from the point of view of Mediators Beyond Borders, it would be like a system like that would be easier to negotiate a resolution for a complicated system, because all you need to do is figure out and identify what the issue is and try and solve it. A complex system is unpredictable, and you have a lot of unknown unknowns. You just don't know what may come up. So like a traffic in a city, you've got so many different variables that are coming in and so many individual actions which could make an impact on how you end up in an accident. Those are what we call unknown unknowns. And then there are also things which are just unknowable, like a car being hit by lightning would be a case where it is functionally random, in terms of how we would look at it. And so this is another aspect of the canvas on which this book wants to help the public, is to understand the differences between all these different kinds of phenomena in Earth systems. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is order and complexity are related but different. So, what happens with order and disorder? So when we move from order to disorder, people might think you're making things more complex. And to some degree you are. But actually what happens is if you get a system which is very disorderly, you can make it eventually less complex. And example of that is when you have a cup of coffee and you add milk to it. Initially, when you add the milk, you are increasing the complexity, and you're also increasing the disorder in terms of that cup, right? Of what's inside it and all the milk and the coffee mixing together. And in science, we use the term entropy, which is a kind of way of describing disorder. It's not precisely disorder, but for our purposes, you can say it is disorder. And what you end up happening then is once the coffee and the milk totally mix and you've got a latte, then actually you've reduced complexity because everything has been homogenized and you've got these structures of the milk proteins linked with the coffee molecules, and you get actually a reduction in complexity. But you have still in the order itself, the entropy has still increased. So you still have a higher degree of diffusion, but you have reduced the complexity. So this is with the coffee, initially you've got the complexity going up and the disorder going up, but then the disorder keeps going up, but the complexity goes down once it's all mixed, right? So similarly in Earth systems, we should think about this too. Like when we have diverse societies, I use the example with for Mediators Beyond Borders, when you have diversity, initially you get a lot of conflict, right? When there's going to be a little bit of a shaking of disorder in that regard, but eventually the complexity, once you get greater degree of harmonization, people understand each other better, you still have a higher degree of entropy at one level. There's more disorder in the sense that you've got people who are much more diffuse, but you reduce the complexity because then people are seeing each other as one. Like, you have certain level of equality. And so then the complexity becomes less and it's easier to manage. But you do have to go through those growing pains, so to speak, in going up that curve. Now, this diagram I'm showing you because it's a way to bring together the bridges between natural, social, and political order. And it comes from the work of the late Cambridge physicist John Barrow. And he tried to wrestle with a lot of these aspects of the fundamental laws of nature also. And he plotted them out in this way. Like if you've got complexity of a phenomenon on the x-axis, if you increase complexity, and on the y-axis, you have uncertainty about the basic equations. Can you actually have an equation to define some outcome? Equations are a way of creating order, right? Mathematically, you write equations to create a certain sense of order. And what he mapped out here is that chemical reactions, for example, you can come up with pretty good equations for them, and the complexity is fairly small. But there are many other things where there is lower uncertainty, like turbulence, but high complexity. In the case of things like particle physics, you have low complexity because, like, for example, with our atom, we have only a certain number of set particles. So you have low complexity, but you have very high uncertainty in terms of the equations. And that's why you get all these very complicated mathematical formulas for theoretical physics. But look over here, this is where the space for MBBI people mostly operating. Social sciences, you have very high complexity and you have very high uncertainty. For social phenomena, it's very difficult to come up with equations. Even though our economist friends like to come up with equations, the reality is those equations are utterly imprecise, and they know that. Economic models are imprecise in that regard, but they're good heuristics. They're good for kind of creating some sense of structure, but we should always recognize that the complexity is far greater than what you can distill into an equation. And that's why you need different kinds of methods. That's why you need qualitative engagement. That's why you need mediators in social phenomena, because it's very difficult to create some kind of convergence of mathematical models around social and behavioral phenomena. Now, this diagram is showing you on the environmental system side, some of the kind of challenges we have of reconciling natural systems and social systems. So this is called the donut diagram, the green donut. And Kate Raworth, who used to work at Oxfam, she came up with this diagram. The red portions outside are what we call planetary boundaries. And that the work on planetary boundaries comes from people like Johan Rockström and Will Steffen, who have looked at natural systems and said, look, there are certain kinds of key variables which we need to keep a track of, because our planet is so sharply tuned to those that if we don't keep track of them, we could really end up in trouble. And so, for example, ocean acidification, certain pollution characteristics, nitrogen and phosphorus loading, biodiversity loss, and all that. So these are the planetary boundaries, and there are people who are measuring them. And the red indicates that we have overtaken the sort of life support system around this, and that we will end up with a future which is going to be less sustainable than where we are coming from because of that. Now, what Kate Raworth did was she combined that with social variables, and she put forward here what is called the social foundations as well. And she said, look, we can talk about planetary boundaries, but we have human beings living on the planet, and there's something basic or minimum that they need in order to have a good quality of life. And so the social foundations she laid forward were food, health, education, income, peace, and justice is there, very relevant to MBBI work, political voice, social equity, gender, housing. So these are the social foundations. So what we need is, we need to keep track of not just the planetary boundaries from the natural science side, but we also need to keep track of the social foundations from the social science side. And the donut, the green donut, is the safe operating space for humanity, as she calls it. That's where we should be aimed at, trying to calibrate our lives and creating order within the green donut. And that's the kind of way in which we should be thinking about these issues. The book also looks at cities. My PhD is in urban and environmental planning, and cities are a way of creating order in human habitation systems. And so I looked at some of the ways in which cities created order in social systems, but also they're a great experiment in terms of how natural and social order can come together. So this is a diagram from the work of Ebenezer Howard, who in the early 20th century wrote this book called The Garden Cities of Tomorrow. And he had this notion of this is how cities should be planned, a very orderly way of like making sure everything comes together. It would be very efficient in terms of energy flows, material flows, and people. But that's not how oftentimes cities end up emerging, because they end up emerging organically, except if they're planned cities like, Canberra, the capital of Australia, or Washington, D.C. to some degree is also a planned city, parts of Manhattan planned. So definitely that is one way of thinking about cities as a microcosm for understanding earthly order. Another way of thinking through, and I talk about this in the second part of the book, is orders of capital. This is the 5 capitals framework that has been used by the British government, where we've got financial capital, human capital, social capital, manufactured capital, and natural capital. And then these are the different ways in which we can further refine those. And capital can be a way of keeping track of order. Another way in which people have thought about this is this notion of panarchy, that how we can have transformation in human systems and natural systems. And panarchy comes from, of course, the Greek mythological character Pan, and so I put him there. But panarchy is it's got sort of a half goat, half human sense, and you can go into the Greek mythology around it, why panarchy was named after him. But basically, it's this sense of like we're trying to have transitions from one kind of space to another if we are moving towards more sustainable systems. And so you get these cycles, which are called panarchy cycles. And these are variables which are telling you how we can move from one cycle to another. So we're transitioning. We often talk about ages of, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age. We talk about the ways in which in the age of industrialization, we're talking about the Anthropocene now, the age of humans as a geological epoch. So how do we transform ourselves to still stay within some limits of these systems of earthly order? So this is one other way of looking through this. With sustainability also, it's important to note that we have these two terms which I use: weak sustainability and strong sustainability. And the book goes into that a bit more. Weak sustainability is the notion that everything has to be physically renewable. So when we talk about renewable resources, we're talking about, being able to regrow crops or forests, and that is, those kinds of things. If we are able to do that, and these are the characteristics of that, what are the implications in the long run? So strong sustainability is where you can replace natural capital with reproducible natural capital or human capital. But in weak sustainability, you can't quite do that, and you are shifting to a different kind of economy. So for example, San Francisco is an example of how you moved from a system that was basically, there were no cities. When, what led to San Francisco was the gold rush. Suddenly you had this injection of people going in for the California gold rush. And you had a situation which was quite unsustainable from a natural capital perspective, because they were taking gold out of the ground and they were not putting gold back in. And what they did was they were creating wealth. They were converting natural capital to financial capital. And that financial capital led to a system of weak sustainability, which now people might say is fine, because what they were able to do is create a service sector economy that got its financial capital from originally natural capital. And now that situation is sustainable. Now people might say, well, they have to import a lot of things, and so it's not sustainable in a strong sustainability sense, but it's sustainable in terms of economic sustainability, and they've moved to a service sector society. And then within that paradigm, they're trying to create micro sustainability. So they're using more public transport. People often think of San Francisco as being a very green city because, people are very aware of their environmental footprint. But it's this distinction between strong sustainability and weak sustainability also, which we should be at least aware of. Another way in which I look into earthly order in one of the chapters is also looking at the notion of risk and accidents. So this is a diagram from a book by Charles Perrault titled Normal Accidents. And I go into a discussion of risks around, what kind of risks are human beings able to predict, and how do we figure out where we are? So what Perrault did was he looked at two variables, coupling and interactions, and he tried to situate where different kinds of risks for accidents happen when we are talking about coupling and interaction. So coupling means like how closely connected are two entities in a system, and interactions are how much communication is happening between them. So here we've got, for example, dams, where they have very tight coupling, so they're very closely related to each other in terms of accidents happening. And they're very linear. It's very easy to see what dams with what happens is you're putting water behind a wall. It's very simple that way, right? And so they're very tightly coupled and they're linear. Whereas a nuclear power plant is very complex, but it's still very tightly coupled because you do know exactly what will lead to what, right? So those things. Whereas if you have something like a university, it's very complex, but it's very loosely coupled because the different departments in the university, there isn't as much of a necessity for them to interact with each other to be functional. You could not have a functional nuclear power plant unless those couples were very tightly interacting with each other and working. Whereas with a lot of social systems, what can happen is you can have loose coupling, complexity, and still functionality, but not optimal functionality. And so that also leads to how we perceive risk, right? So the risk of a university failing, or an organization like MBBI for that matter, if MBBI was much bigger, the chance of it failing would be less than when it was smaller, some would argue. We often use this term too big to fail, right? Because then other factors will come in and do. So that's another way of thinking about how we organize our world in terms of managing risk and how order is constructed. So the book also has a chapter on that. And then I look at borders specifically for those of you who are very interested in mediating across physical borders. There's a whole chapter which is on borders and how borders are a form of order. This is where I bring in a lot of my mediation background actually in detail in this chapter, where I give solutions for specific conflicts like the Arab-Israeli conflict, using this notion of order in the context of complex systems analysis. And I also look at, some South Asian conflicts. I talk a bit about Afghanistan, for example, and I look at ways in which borders these are 5 kind of categories of functionality of borders for political regulation, economic regulation, social, cultural, and ecological regulation, and the objects of those regulations and how those would play out as well. So, but that's a way in which I look at it in more further detail. And then finally in the book, I look at Earth systems governance. Like, can we actually have order for the planet? Can we have a planetary government? That would be the ultimate form of linking social and economic order with political order for the planet. So, I use this typology from a young a researcher who's based in the Netherlands at Utrecht University, Ra-Hyun Kim, whom I've worked with in the past. And he uses this notion of moving from environmental law to ecological law to earth law. And he also says on the other end that right now we have international law, we need global or transnational law, and then planetary law. And then he has this way of ultimately moving towards earth-centered law for governance by all living beings from a planetary systems perspective. We're certainly not there yet. Will we ever get there? There is, in the science fiction world, there is a future like that. Those of you who are Star Trek fans, Gene Roddenberry's great vision for the planet long-term was one of the ways which he portrays in Star Trek, is that there was an Earth systems law and governance. And you had things like the Prime Directive. And how did that happen in the Star Trek mythology? The way it happened was that basically when human beings faced an external threat, when there was first contact with a non-human civilization, a more intelligent non-human civilization, they all united and they created a global government. And before that, they didn't. And so there is, if you go into the Star Trek episodes, and certainly one of the Star Trek movies, they talk about that point of first contact, which led to Earth law. And that in the Star Trek universe, you have no countries. So you have no political borders, and you also have no money, because by then there is no need for money, because you have made scarcity extinct more or less through technological means. So, it seems very far off and distant, but it's good to have these, visions. And so that's also a part of the discussion. And then, I use this diagram also, which is showing us in terms of how crisis can lead us to either evolution or fragmentation. And we are kind of at this point, really. And so the book ends, this is in the conclusion, this diagram, with this sense of like, where do we go from here? And we hope we will be able to move in this direction towards a more complex social system rather than moving towards fragmentation. But sadly, the situation in a lot of the world makes us feel we're moving more in this direction. But that's also part of the goal of the book, is in that regard. So take-home messages, these are the 5 take-home messages. Patterns raise useful questions, but not always useful answers, as I said about the prejudice issue. Natural order is ultimate, but humanistic order is proximate. So we do know that it is natural order is the outer part of that Venn diagram, but we shouldn't become deterministic. We should still figure out functionally how can humanistic order and how we relate to each other help us with organizing natural systems. Transitions in and out of order are not always reversible in space and time. And this goes back to the basic tenets of the laws of nature. We have such a thing as irreversible reactions, and irreversibility is what actually leads to emergence of life. I mean, the origins of life, actually fascinating topic of how life emerged from chemical substances, because life itself it's a big mystery. Like, how did living beings emerge? And life is an irreversible reaction at some point afterwards, because when you die, it's very difficult to bring someone back to life, right? It's a complex system. You could try and fix everything, but you have created an irreversible reaction, more or less. You can freeze people and so on. But once they die, like physically, that whole complex system interaction breaks. Very difficult. We don't know how to. And it's quite probable that it's not possible at all to do it, because unless we inject enormous amounts of energy and resources, which is the other side of the laws of nature of how you completely, transform an irreversible reaction. But that's part of it. For functional purposes, we can say that certain reactions, irreversible, cannot be brought back. And then tipping points can lead to accelerated order and disorder, and there's a, Malcolm Gladwell's very popular book on tipping points, people may be familiar with. But a lot of it is that a lot of that deals with acceleration of disorder, but it's also that you can have tipping points can lead to accelerated order. And that's how you get, in fact, the emergence of life can happen under those conditions, is that you get order under certain conditions. That's why scientists believe that life evolved in the deep sea and hydrothermal vents, where we were able to get these kind of tipping points towards accelerated order. And then you were able to get the first cell, and then, first organisms and so on. And then finally, earthly order can both be discovered and invented. That's a key lesson. I want it to be clear that we're not just saying that there is some order and you're finding it, but we have the agency to also invent order. All right, so this is sort of the one-line punch for the book, because I know it's such a complex topic. I always like to give people some one-liner, but keeping in mind that this can't do justice to the full topic at hand. But to meet contemporary challenges of human sustainability, we need to meaningfully connect political notions of world order, which is what we often use. People like Henry Kissinger, who've written 700-page books on world order, but we don't connect those with natural constraints of what I call earthly order. And that we need to be moving from this notion of world order to earthly order, which is more realistic and grounded. And so that's it, final coda, and happy to take questions. Sorry, I went a little longer than I had hoped, but happy to take your feedback and questions. Thank you. All right, Ben, are you there? Ben, ready to?
Yes, I'm here. Feel free to unmute yourselves, everyone, and directly engage with Saleem. Go for it, Suzanne.
So I really apologize that I was late this morning. And so I want to ask a question, and I hope I'm not being redundant in what you've discussed before, but it has to do with your reference to earthly order. And so it's really, I love these points that you've made, that earthly order can be both discovered and invented, because we, I live in the notion, and I think a lot of people I read and know also live in the notion that there is one order that you need to learn about, be clear about, and the more you understand, the less complicated and conflict-based your life will be.
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, I think I would say that, one of the things that we often try to do is we want to simplify our lives. And the real challenge is simplifying without getting to the point where you are missing out. So like, and this goes back to that point about prejudice. There's a wonderful Nigerian writer, Chimamanda Adichie. You may have heard her TED Talk. She's a MacArthur Fellow and great writer. And she gave a talk about, it says, The Danger of a Single Story, it's called. And what she says is, with stereotypes, the danger is, it's the problem with stereotypes, she says, is not that they are wrong, but that they are incomplete. And so I think that for me has been one of the motivating forces for me to write this book, is that if we should try and simplify, but if we oversimplify it, it is very dangerous. In fact, it can take us in a really very violent direction at times. And so, that's been, for me, one of the reasons finding a publisher for this book was very difficult that way too, because I wanted to go with a good publisher. I'm very grateful to Oxford University Press, because they gave me the space to write with nuance, but also to price it in a way where it's still affordable for a general audience, which is very difficult to do with books these days. So, the trade publishers I'd go to, like Random House Penguin types, they would be like, so what's your one argument? They just wanted that one-liner, which I still provided. But I told them the book is not going to be a one-argument book, because I'm writing about Earth systems. And if I try to dumb it down too much, it will be actually misleading to the reader about what reality we're talking about. So it goes back to also, like, Alexander Pope's essay on criticism, where he famously said, a little learning is a dangerous thing. Drink deep or taste not the Pierian spring. Its shallow draughts intoxicate the brain, but drinking largely sobers us again.
Oh, that's a great quote. Thank you for that, Saleem. And so just, one last comment about the world, the earthly order. What I'm taking away is that we need to be aware of orders, but orders with an S, so that there is more than one order, and it's for us to understand, or at least be open to create.
Absolutely. There could be, though, I mean, part of the reason why I didn't put an S in the title was that ultimately I want people to also find a point of convergence around what kind of order we want. There are multiple orders, but what do we find consensus on for the planet? Because at the planetary level, we do have to figure out, we don't have planet B. So we do have to figure out some unified convergence ultimately. But yes, thank you, Suzanne, for those insights.
Thank you.
Yes, David.
I found this an absolutely brilliant and timely analysis of something that I wrestle with every day. As soon as this meeting is over, I go into a book club discussing the book Breeding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, which it's so coincidental that here you are talking about what she, in her Native American indigenous way as a scientist, speaks about all sentient and non-sentient beings somehow working in harmony. So at one stage, the earth, nature, the natural order can say to humans, thank you. Up until this point in time, there's been no reason to express gratitude to humans for what they have done to the natural order. So my question, as I wrestle with a legal background and a great concern about the inadequacies of international law and the ineffective capacities to deal with existential threats like nuclear weapons and certainly like the slower death of climate change. I ask myself, how can each one of us, now all of us are with Mediators Beyond Borders, so we have a background in dispute resolution and training and orientation. But how do we get across to a critical mass of people in the world, besides what your book does? Okay.
Yeah.
But how do we get that across to people that really don't want to wrestle with this? They're too struggling with day-to-day survival and all of the complexities of raising children and paying debt and fulfilling a career within an organization which is structured and is the order that you're suppressed within until you achieve a level of freedom and independence, which I've been able to achieve simply by living long enough and saving enough money and now being able to be as free and independent as a human being can possibly be. So my question really relates to asking you to comment on what I have been offering. Rotary has a four-way test. And the four-way test is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it be beneficial to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? And what I've been suggesting is that the word all concerned should mean, in today's world where we're threatened with self-inflicted destruction, all concerned, or neighbor in the love thy neighbor concept of religion, should be asking yourself in a self-analysis, is it, the first thing, of course, is it the truth? So we humans with our limited educations, limited capacities, that's very difficult to determine, but let's assume we all do our best. So then you ask yourself, who is all concerned, right? When I talk about fairness to all concerned, beneficial to all, who is all concerned? So I suggest that all concerned is everyone, everywhere. The wisdom and goodness and if you believe in the spirituality of ancestors, the generations behind us. It's the generations ahead of us, the generations ahead of us. And then it's all sentient and non-sentient beings. So if you're going to then determine what to be thinking about and what to be expressing and writing and whatever, and doing, making a decision of what to do. So in that self-analysis, if all of these things which you express, which I totally agree with, are part of our future, how do we as individual human beings make the best decisions about what to think about, what to express, and what to do in the description of the multiple systems and concepts of order that you have described?
Yes, thank you, David, for those really very astute insights about the limits of what is possible with knowledge sharing. I mean, one of that is there that, we have to recognize that with any book that you write, you have to know that there is only people who have the time and space to absorb it. But for some aspects of that is that, those are often, I would hope, people in influence who can then make a difference for those who are not able to have the time and space to read this kind of material. And I do make an argument, though, in some of my popular writings that we should have a level of what I call environmental literacy or ecological literacy in schools, basic schools. I mean, we have now health literacy. People are, kids are taught you've got to know how to wash your hands and so on. We should have foundational knowledge about Earth systems in our school curriculum. And there is a sense now that a right to education, at least up to secondary schooling, is a fundamental right of children. And I do feel that we need to have that. I mean, this book itself is very suitable for high schools as well, as well as college students, if that, it can be read at both levels. I certainly hope your book club will read it in your next round, perhaps. But I mean, the other question which you bring up, which is really important, is also about this aspect of suboptimality, and knowing that, we will have to make choices. And one of the issues that people have in the environmental movement is a utopian movement. There's a sense of there was a Garden of Eden and let's return to it. There's this sense of like, there was this wild nature. There was this time before human intervention. And that still permeates a lot of environmental discourse. And what I've tried to do is have a much more pragmatic approach to it. And that's been around, well, human beings are part of nature. I've always had this sense of, industrial systems even. And there's a whole field called industrial ecology, which is saying that, industry is part of nature too. And so we should try to figure out a way to incorporate industrial systems within natural systems. That doesn't mean we do it everywhere. We want to have some areas where we are, preserving nature in its form. We have these wonderful wild areas and national parks and so on. But if we have that kind of a pragmatic approach, I think we would have less despair, and we would have less sense of this kind of atavistic approach to a bygone era of this harmony with nature. And I should mention, you were noting that the book you're reading is around indigenous cultures. My PhD dissertation was around environmental conflicts between indigenous people and mining companies. And so I am very closely familiar with indigenous traditions in North America, particularly around nature, from that early research I did. And I learned a lot from my indigenous friends and how they relate to nature. But there are immense debates within indigenous societies too about, what should be the evolution of nature culture and of indigenous cultures. They don't want to be considered ossified museum pieces either. They want to be considered just as dynamic as any other culture many times. They want to have this balance between the past and the present. I think that's how we should approach our engagement on these issues also in any society is. And then there's this notion of individual choice and how to balance individual choice with collective choice of, where people do not have collective choice oftentimes, and we are reliant on individual choice. And how much can we constrain individual choice with laws? I argue that's where we if we have a better science policy interface, we can hopefully have individual choice still empowered up to a point where it is still aware of and literate about the confines of natural order. And this, for example, this recent Supreme Court decision just last week with the West Virginia case with the coal-fired power plants, that's a classic case where the science policy interface is divorced. The legal system has become so detached from scientific reality that the Supreme Court is making decisions on minutiae of nitty-gritty of what was intended by Congress and this. Nature doesn't care less about that, So, and we have become so detached from that then you can find any loopholes to find ways to justify certain decisions based on ideological preferences on what are state rights versus what was the intent of Congress, this case was specifically about whether EPA had exceeded its mandate under the Clean Air Act. Well, the Clean Air Act is a reductionist piece of legislation. We should have systems-oriented legislations which connect air and water and waste systems and consider planetary constraints rather than making these reductionist decisions. So that's an example. So I think that if we even made reforms at that level, it would help in the long run.
Just one brief comment, if I may.
Yes, sure.
Is that as a lawyer, one of the big problems of the legal system and that Supreme Court decision and many of the Supreme Court decisions in the United States and certainly Canada as well, is that we don't have a voice representing air and water and fire, that is energy, and earth. So again, the indigenous peoples in tribal law, for example, gave personification, gave standing to the Klamath River, right?
Yes.
But if you don't have a voice in the whole, like peacemaking Ukraine, Russian Federation, if you don't have not only the voice of the vast majority of the peoples of the world, the oppressed, the impoverished, the vulnerable peoples and future generations, and women especially, if you don't have them with a voice, you don't have the human capital represented at all. And you have zero representation and participation of the sentient and non-sentient beings, which aren't human, right?
Yeah.
So until we get to that stage, I mean, frankly, you speak about we shouldn't despair. Well, I'm pretty close to despairing because of the challenges, but all that does is motivate me to do more, right? Because we must do it. I will certainly buy some of your books, and I hope you put a link and how I can go about and do that.
Yes, I put the, if you use Amazon, I put the Amazon link there.
Good.
Yes, whether it's electronic or in paper, but thank you so much. And certainly I would welcome feedback from, if you're a Rotarian, I'd love to spread the word among Rotary clubs, if they're book clubs and all, I think that would be wonderful. And as I said, I'm donating all the royalties. Really, I'm not interested in making money from this. We've got, UNESCO has an environmental literacy program and others. I'm still considering where I would put the charity in, but yes, that would be wonderful.
I'm going to invite you to participate in you can check out the CRIC, Conflict Research Resilient Institute, Canada, which is just CRIC, CRRIC.org. And you check it out, and I'd love to have you participate in that. And thanks for all the time.
No, thank you so much, David.
You're a brilliant man, and you're doing some brilliant work. And I just hope that it can be implemented with more and more people understanding it. Thank you.
Thank you so much.